Welcome to another episode of Threads of Conversation, the show where I ask my guests to talk me through their life and career via 5 items of clothing. Today, I'm excited to welcome the V&A's senior fashion curator, Sonnet Stanfill, to discuss Elsa Schiaparelli, the subject of the V&A's newest fashion exhibition, Fashion Becomes Art, which Sonnet curated. In this conversation, Sonnet tells us more about Schiaparelli and selects 5 key pieces from the show to tell us more about the designer's life and work, including her close friendship with surrealist artists like Salvador Dalí and Man Ray. We also discuss Sonnet's own work, the process of curating a fashion exhibition, and acquiring pieces for the V&A's collection. If you're listening on audio, a reminder that you can watch the video version to see inside this incredible exhibition and experience Schiaparelli's pieces up close. If you enjoyed the episode, then don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok. Sonnet, welcome to Threads of Conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'd love to talk a bit about Elsa Schiaparelli, the person, because she really was this sort of larger-than-life character with so many eccentricities. So can you just give a brief overview of her life? Because she had this, didn't she? She met her husband and they were engaged on the same day, and then they sort of... He was a bit of a con man, and then they moved to New York, and then they split up, but she had a child, and then she came back here, and she started her brand with no formal fashion training, which is incredible, especially when you talk about that technical detail of like going and sourcing all the fabrics. And tell us about Elsa the woman.
Yes, well, she led a life that was anything but conventional. And of course, the title of her autobiography is Shocking Life, appropriate. She was born in Rome into a family of aristocrats and intellectuals. I think she was destined for a life, in the view of her parents, a life in the background with an advantageous marriage. And she was having none of that. So she, as you said, she left Italy, moved to the UK, met and instantly became engaged to a young theosophist, William Went to Keller.
What is a theosophist?
A set of spiritual beliefs that emphasizes the kind of uncanny.
Right. Sounds a bit Russell Brand to me.
Yes. This was a belief system that maybe veered a bit into the kind of ideas around magic, around communing with the deceased, around a kind of spiritualism that was outside of traditional religious canons. This idea of kind of interest in the otherworldly was something that Elsa shared with her husband, but I think it came from the fact that one of her most important family members was her uncle, Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was a astronomer, and he was the youngest head of the Brera Observatory. And he used to take Elsa as a young girl to look at the stars. But he also talked to her about his belief in the inhabitants of Mars, in Martians. And I think that combination of kind of scientific rigor with the sort of almost fantasy world, and looking at the heavens as a young child with her uncle really was quite formative. And if you look across her collections, everything from Zodiac collection, which features stars and moons and celestial symbols, to even her circus collection, which again, the circus is a site for kind of the uncanny, for the magical, for the slightly otherworldly, out of the ordinary. There's like a through line that goes across her career, a kind of red thread that connects this formative experience as a young girl, spending time with her uncle, the astronomer, to her creative output. So yes, she shared these beliefs with her husband, who seemed to be always one step ahead of the law, accused of false palm readings and claiming to be able to speak with the dead and so on. But, I think that they shared that interest, but it soon became clear that he, was not interested in being a steady companion in her life. So as their marriage fell apart, she gave birth to their daughter, and that prompted her to need to sort of forge a career that would support them both. And she then eventually, as you mentioned, found her way to fashion. She, as an untrained outsider, she found her way to the beating heart of Paris haute couture. It's really an extraordinary story of grit, determination, also mentorship by other women like Gabrielle Buffet-Bacabia, the wife of the artist Francis Bacabia, who connected Elsa, the young Elsa, to artists like Man Ray. Chance encounter with the great couturier Paul Poiret, who encouraged her and gifted her with clothes. And slowly she gained experience through designing for a small couture house called Maison Lamballe, just for a year, but it gave her the confidence to then start her own line of fashion. And in 1927, it started with a sweater.
Those amazing trompe-l'oeil sweaters, which we see in the
Yes.
exhibition as you enter, which just took off. They were the craze of Paris.
The fashion hit of 1927. And as Elsa writes in her autobiography, soon all of the women in the Ritz were there in the restaurant at the Ritz wearing black and white sweaters. So that enabled her to gain enough financial resources to then eventually in 1935, she moved to Place Vendôme, number 21 Place Vendôme, the kind of grandest square in Paris, the heart of the luxury trade in Paris, and a multi-story couture salon with many rooms, enough space to employ 400 people and produce over 7,000 garments a year. So very quickly, she went from the kind of fashion newcomer to being the most talked about designer of interwar Paris. And I think that her life is a kind of incredible story of determination, business acumen, partnering with other businesses like shoemakers, corset makers, to gain, these partnerships really helped to kind of give her further financial success to then reinvest into her business. I think what comes across in her autobiography is how important it was to her, these connections with the artists. She writes about working with people like Man Ray, people like Salvador Dalí and Jean Cocteau, Bébé Berard. She said it gives one a sense of exhilaration. And that word exhilaration to me is very telling, because you get a sense that the physical thrill that she got with the spark that she took away from working with the leading artists of her time. And I think that's something that, fashion historians and also art historians take away from her life story, is that element of connectivity with artists, but also craftspeople, jewelry makers, shoemakers. She was pulling together around her a constellation of creatives that were the best in their métier.
I love that you use the word constellation there, because it's so apt for her, who was really interested in stars and astrology and star signs, and those decorate so many of her pieces. What was the kind of cultural climate of that era, the sort of 1930s when she first came up? Were people able to be more daring? Because her pieces were really progressive and often quite daring.
Yes.
And being a sort of independent woman, it's not something that you think of so much in that era. What was society like?
Well, I think what's important to remember is that at the time that Elsa Schiaparelli was starting out, women did not have the vote in France. And you really, I think, have to put Elsa Schiaparelli's accomplishments in the context of that time. She wasn't alone in being a successful female designer. One, of course, instantly thinks of Gabrielle Coco Chanel, who was her contemporary. But Elsa Schiaparelli was designing in a very different aesthetic. Many of Elsa Schiaparelli's fashion couturier contemporaries, people like Chanel, but also others, were designing clothes that were often very kind of conventionally glamorous. And Elsa's clothes, many of them really stand apart in, they were quite shocking. The very first garment that you see in the exhibition is the skeleton dress, co-designed with Salvador Dalí, and it's got a skeleton superimposed on the surface of the gown. It's shocking, it's macabre, it's anatomically very kind of detailed. There's hip bones, a rib cage, there's collarbones, there's a spine. It's very eerie and quite unsettling. But it also connects very much to this work with artists because it's a collaboration with Dalí, and we know they had conversations about this piece. And so in that work with artists, in creating dresses that were startling, that were conversation pieces, Elsa Schiaparelli stood apart from her contemporaries. She was doing something very different, very bold, intentionally provocative.
Did she have any conflict with anyone? Because she is quite a sort of divisive figure. And I know there's the legend of her having a sort of big rivalry with Coco Chanel.
I think that is somewhat overemphasized posthumously by the press. We know that Elsa Schiaparelli invited Gabrielle Chanel to dinner at her house. That's a very intimate thing to do. We know that they moved in similar circles. They had some of the same friends. They went to the same balls and parties. I think that this supposed rivalry comes from the fact that Gabrielle Chanel is known to have said or referred to Elsa Schiaparelli as that Italian artist who's making clothes, which I think was intended as a put down, but probably Elsa Schiaparelli took it as a compliment. And then, their aesthetics are so different. And so there may have been, I know that there were some clients who did shop at both. Gala Dalí, wife of Salvador Dalí, I know shopped at Chanel and at Schiaparelli, but their aesthetics were so different that I really don't think that they were competing for the same clientele. I think you were largely either a Schiaparelli client or a Chanel client. So I'm not sure that this idea of a rivalry really holds up.
And Schiaparelli's clients were an amazing group of women.
Yes.
They're all sort of these often quite scandalous women or leading these very bold lives.
A lot of actors, actresses. There's sportswomen, the aviator Amy Johnson, who's the first woman to fly from London to South Africa. Schiaparelli created a travel wardrobe for her. We have on display garments worn by Marlene Dietrich, as well as Mae West. And you had to have, I think, a certain confidence and sense of self-assurance to pull off gowns like the skeleton dress or the tears dress or the shoe hat, which was also designed with Salvador Dalí. It's fashioned like an upside down shoe, kind of following in the surrealist tradition of turning the world on its head. So you had to have a certain, as I say, kind of confidence about you to carry some of these pieces.
You've chosen 5 pieces from your new Schiaparelli exhibition, Fashion Becomes Art. You're going to take us inside the exhibition.
Yes, each one says something a little different about the exhibition and about the journey of curating it.
This is the piece that reminds you of your education. Can you tell me about this amazing dress?
I studied history of art at university, and I was fascinated even then as a university student with the story of Elsa Schiaparelli and her connection with artists. So this dress, which is called the skeleton dress, it dates from Elsa Schiaparelli's summer 1938 circus collection. It is really a kind of talking point for all of the key elements of Elsa Schiaparelli's work. First, it has a very fashionable line. It's a columnar, full-length evening gown. Second, it represents her work with one of the leading artists of the time, Salvador Dalí. And we know that they worked closely together on this dress because there's a sketch that we've included in the exhibition that Dalí did of female skeletons in different fashionable poses. And he writes a note to Elsa at the bottom of the drawing saying, "Dear Elsa, I quite like this idea of the bones on the outside." And this is a prompt to, and a kind of nod to the surrealist impulse of turning the world upside down, bringing the wearer's insides to the surface of the gown. And you can see the wonderful stitched detail. There's wadding threaded through and then stitched over top to create the outline of a human skeleton. And it's very macabre, it's very unsettling, but it's essentially sort of saying to the world that this gown is like a walking wearable work of art. So to me, as someone who studied history of art before I became a fashion curator, this is such a link to and representative of Elsa Schiaparelli's work with the artists of her day. And it wasn't just that she was kind of borrowing surrealist motifs for her garments, there was a dialogue, a conversation between Elsa and the artist that was very fluid. And that note from Dalí to Elsa that suggests that we're kind of, when you read it, I felt like I was entering midstream into a conversation between the two of them. They were just having a little chat, because he signs it, before he signs his name at the bottom, he says, "See you later tonight."
Amazing.
So you kind of imagine they'll be having dinner together at a cafe in Paris. So this is a real highlight of Elsa Schiaparelli's career. And this example, this dress, is the only known surviving original skeleton dress of Elsa Schiaparelli's career. So the fact that it's in the V&A's collection and part of our permanent holdings of fashion is a real it's a real highlight of the V&A's fashion collection.
Yeah, there are two things I want to ask about the dress. So we were talking about these amazing zips and how Elsa used these zips, which seem even today so modern, this sort of big plastic zip. And I think you said it has 5?
Yes. There's zips at the shoulders, down the side, and at the wrists. And this was another feature of her work that was, using a fastening that was quite a novelty still at that time. Zips were mainly used for functional outerwear, galoshes. So to insert them into an haute couture made-to-measure evening dress with a very delicate fabric, and also to make them quite large, kind of supersize them, made them very noticeable. So Schiaparelli was unique at this time as a couturier, including zips as a very visible, noticeable design feature.
Can you tell me a little bit about, it was Ruth Ford that this was made for?
Yes.
Who was quite tell me about Ruth.
So she was an actress. She was American. Her brother was a surrealist poet. So she was kind of part of the wider milieu of the surrealist circle. And we know that the art collector and poet Edward James was a friend of Ruth Ford, and he used to buy clothes for her from Schiaparelli Paris to gift to Ruth to wear. And we know that this is one of the pieces that he bought for her at Schiaparelli's atelier. And she then later donated it to the V&A. And it was part of a very large group of garments that entered the museum in 1974. Well, a little bit earlier, they were displayed in 71 in an exhibition that was curated by the fashion photographer Cecil Beaton. And several of the other pieces that we're talking about today have that same trajectory of coming in via Cecil Beaton for his exhibition called Fashion and Anthology that took place at the museum in 1971. And then those pieces were then acquired by the museum a few years later.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about him later, because I was so interested to learn that he was such a sort of collector, and obviously I knew he was a photographer and such a famous photographer, but the fact that he had such an involvement in terms of collecting fashion and donating it to the V&A, and it really shows you how inextricably linked all of these people were. They weren't just operating in their own discipline. Elsa was friends with the surrealists, and they were sort of chatting and saying, "See you later," inspiring one another. And even the fact that she did the lobster dress before the lobster phone, but then Salvador Dalí had done the drawing, which was for a bathing suit. It almost feels like a nod to how subversive Elsa was to open the show also with something black, given how, she's really known for shocking pink in her colors. So it feels like, sort of subversive curatorial choice to start with something that is a more subtle piece of hers.
True.
Cool. All right. Should we move on to your next piece?
Let's do it.
Yeah. This is the piece that makes you feel part of something.
So this was worn by the dressmaker and art collector Rosalind Gilbert to her wedding at Golders Green Synagogue in London in 1934. And the reason why it makes me feel part of something is that this is an example of how important it is to work collaboratively with colleagues across the museum to make an exhibition like this come to fruition. And this gown is on loan from the Gilbert collection to the V&A, but the Gilberts also have their own gallery dedicated to their art collection upstairs within the museum. So it connects very much to the V&A as an institution. And the thing to me that I don't think that most of our visitors will understand when they come through is that I know how much time and expertise went into conserving this wedding dress, because there were stains on the dress that had to be removed. And the dress, the wearer. She was quite petite. So we had to find a special mannequin. We had to, commission and purchase a specially petite mannequin for this dress. And also the way that the dress falls on the mannequin and sits, you don't see all the underpinnings and the kind of gentle padding that goes on underneath the gown to make sure that it looks its best on display. Also the way that the veil has been draped, it had to be very, very carefully steamed. So there is hours and hours of V&A colleagues, staff time, going into making this dress look its best on display, into kind of negotiating the loan of this dress from the Gilbert collection and installing it perfectly to make it look gorgeous. So I'm so grateful to my colleagues across the museum for all of their expertise. And I just remember when this dress was installed, I had sort of this vision of, I could see in my mind's eye, I can see all of the conservators gathered round to kind of make sure that the skirt fanned out just so, and the veil fell beautifully. And I just got such a thrill. And I just felt this incredible sense of gratitude during the installation when I saw this dress go in. It also, to me, is exciting to be able to display the only known surviving example of an Elsa Schiaparelli wedding dress. So that's also very, very special. And the fact that it has a Schiaparelli London label, it wasn't made in her Paris salon, but in her London house. That's also very rare and quite exciting.
So the piece that reminds you of a sort of seemingly very dignified ensemble with a cheeky detail.
Well, I absolutely love the fact that this evening dress and coat was worn to the coronation of 1937. She made this dress and coat for someone who was very highly established in British society. She was the wife of the director of the National Gallery. So this was worn by Jane Clark, the wife of Kenneth Clark, while everyone else was buying British couture. She chose an Italian-born, Paris-based designer to dress her for the coronation. And at such a somber occasion, she wore a gown and coat. The coat fastens with a button made to look like a naked mermaid. It's just, the sense of humor is wonderful.
I know, nipples and all.
Nipples and all.
Yeah, because I was reading about, is it Kenneth and Jane?
Yes.
And they were quite a out there couple, and they had quite a tempestuous marriage and sort of, lots of affairs and things.
Yes.
So I feel like it's very emblematic of, sort of buttoned up on the outside, but actually buttoned up with quite a cheeky sort of detail.
Yes, exactly.
Wonderful. So the piece that represents a surprise.
This is a surprise because it's actually a piece that's not designed by Elsa Schiaparelli. It's created by the surrealist artist Eileen Agar. The glove hat. And why it's in the exhibition is because it was reported in the press that Eileen Agar wore a pair of Schiaparelli gloves to an art opening in London. But we have examined these gloves, and we don't think that they're designed by, or they're actually made by Elsa Schiaparelli, because they look a little bit too DIY. Elsa Schiaparelli, one of her kind of famous glove designs was a pair of kid gloves with superimposed where the fingernails should have been little roundels to represent the fingernails made of red snakeskin.
Wow.
To suggest a manicured pair of hands. Yeah. So this very kind of surrealist trompe-l'oeil idea. And what we think happened was that Eileen Agar took inspiration from this and then either herself created or had someone else create a similar pair that it's, it's kind of very much DIY. They look a little bit rough, the way that the nails are kind of sewn in, but it is very much a nod to surrealism with this kind of random shell pin attaching the gloves to a hat made of straw. So it was, designed to be worn, but it's actually not an example of fashion. It's a work of art, it's a sculpture. And so this dialogue between Elsa and the artists continues. And I thought that it would definitely be an element of surprise for our visitors to see a work of art by Eileen Agar in an exhibition about Elsa Schiaparelli. But in the sort of looking at Schiaparelli's career, this is very much a kind of part of that incredible story.
Do you think she minded the imitators?
She once said that Coco Chanel, that imitation was a form of flattery. But we do know that Schiaparelli also took certain steps to try to kind of copyright and protect some of her designs. So it's a kind of interesting story of a bit of contradiction.
This is the ensemble that you've chosen that reminds you of your career.
This is an ensemble that was part of Elsa Schiaparelli's Autumn 1937 collection. And I suppose I would say it's the first Elsa Schiaparelli garment that I researched and wrote about in depth for a publication that V&A director Tristram Hunt commissioned and edited, which is titled Lives of the Objects, talking about the stories around how highlight objects in the V&A's collections across the different métiers, how they found their way into the museum. And this is an evening suit of a jacket and skirt that was worn by Lady Alexandra Haig. She bought it in 1937. And what's so wonderful about it is that it not only does it sum up the kind of tour de force embroidery of the House of Lesage, which Elsa Schiaparelli included in so many of her designs, but it was also worn by a friend of Cecil Beaton, who was the photographer who amassed a very large collection of fashion that then ended up in the V&A. And so it's got a lot of sort of wonderful talking points around it, both with regards to the fashion collection generally at the museum, because as I said, Cecil Beaton facilitated so many donations, but also it's a kind of quintessential Schiaparelli piece with luxurious silk velvet textile, this incredible surface embellishment, which features flat metal strip embroidery, sequins, crystals, starburst buttons colored shocking pink. So it's a really kind of extraordinary example of essentially the kind of ultimate fashion creation, which is a made-to-measure haute couture garment.
What makes a good fashion exhibition?
For me, I guess the base of it is that it's grounded in rigorous research, that there's a story there that hangs together. It presents information to the visitor that they may not know before coming. And I think that element is really important. Often it's communicated through the exhibition text, through the interpretation. And I recognize that not everyone reads everything that's on the walls. But hopefully there's a kind of narrative thread that runs through that provides a kind of a rigor and a gathering together of information that makes sense. I also think that exhibitions that are successful are presented beautifully. And the aesthetic of the presentation is very important. It's almost like it's hard to define what that is, but you kind of know it when you see it. It's hard to kind of describe it in words, what visually makes an exhibition successful, but it's about a kind of pacing of the way the objects are placed. It's about juxtapositions and what is next to what. That has to make sense intellectually, but it also has to look good. And so if something's presenting an interesting narrative that's well researched, that's grounded in rigorous research, hopefully also presenting new information that the visitor may not know, and also is visually just spectacular and carefully installed and presented, I think that's the kind of baseline. And then there's also the elements of lighting and exhibition design that's so important. And often the visitor, you notice it when it's not done well, but hopefully all of that is not that it's not noticeable, but that it's done so well that it's not a feature, because the exhibition design and the lighting are crucial, but they're meant to kind of amplify the objects on display. Often I think the curator of an exhibition is the one, like myself today, put forward as the spokesperson for a project. Yes, we are the ones that decide what goes in and what's said about them, what objects are included and what is written or said about those objects. But an exhibition is a collaborative effort, and I cannot emphasize enough the importance of the multitude of colleagues across different departments, different sections of the museum with different specialisms. Everything from our technical services team who create the mounts for things like accessories and jewelry, to our fashion and textiles conservation team who conserve the objects that we display, to the mounting team that create the underpinnings and pad out the mannequins to make them look impeccable, to the press team. I mean, it's just a cast of many who are the invisible people behind the exhibition that make it possible for my idea to come to fruition so that we can welcome people through the doors. It is such a group effort, and I feel so fortunate that I work with some of the best in the business.
Well, I'm sure they'd say the same about you. You mentioned there that a lot of your more sort of desk time is researching and also deciding what to purchase for the V&A and add to the collection. You have the biggest fashion collection of any museum in the whole world. Is that
Not quite, but we are definitely one of the big ones. Yeah.
And how do you decide, of all of the amazing fashion pieces out there, what to add in?
Yes, and so we are very fortunate that because we're a charity, people often are very generous and will donate because the majority of what we add to our collection is through donation rather than purchase. And I think that increasingly, with the challenges of time and budget restraints, we are also thinking very carefully about what we acquire, thinking more than ever with great care about what we add to the permanent collection. And often, it has to be in very good condition because we don't have the resources to spend time conserving every single piece that we acquire. So it has to be in good condition and stable. It often you have to argue that it is likely to be displayed, because that's also an important element, that things are acquired that we can share with the public. And then I think in terms of the kind of the design story around the piece, which is probably the kind of driving element of what would interest our visitors, it's if a designer is very well known and we already have examples of their work, it has to be something that is not represented already in the collection. It's not that we don't acquire designs by unknown makers, but often there has to be an argument that it's an example of leading design. And what that means could differ from designer to designer. It could be somebody whose early career but is engaged in a creative practice that's really innovative. Or it could be a way of working with materials that's really interesting, or have a link to the V&A. There's all kinds of things that you have to think about and argue why this piece, how you justify it taking up a space in a storage cupboard in the V&A's collections.
Is there a recent acquisition that you are really excited about?
Well, I just curated an exhibition just before the exhibition Schiaparelli, Fashion Becomes Art, an exhibition called Naomi in Fashion, about the career of the supermodel Naomi Campbell. We were offered a donation of a John Galliano dress that Naomi Campbell had worn on the catwalk. It wasn't the actual one that she wore, but it was the same design. And so we were able to include it in the Naomi in Fashion exhibition to kind of exemplify her work with John Galliano on the catwalk. So that was such serendipity. It was such good fortune that coincided at the same time with the exhibition. And it's an early career moment for Naomi. And, we always are interested in telling stories of a kind of intersection in the fashion industry and in this case, it was of a very prominent model with a very prominent designer.
Speaking of serendipity, it feels like you always manage to put on the right fashion exhibition at the right moment. And yet the planning, I imagine, starts way beyond, what people are going to be thinking and talking about at that moment. So coming back to Schiaparelli, tell me about the seed of that idea. How did it flower into the exhibition that you have now?
So I think I first talked about doing a Schiaparelli exhibition more than 7 years ago when our director of exhibitions, Daniel Slater, had just arrived at the V&A in post. And that conversation took place over 7 years ago. And so it took a while for the idea to kind of make its way through the different stages of an exhibition proposal. That conversation was what then blossomed into this project. And I think that the fact that the V&A, it's our own collection, holds such strong examples of Elsa Schiaparelli's work, combined with the fact that Daniel Roseberry, creative director at the house since 2019, has had such a meteoric rise and has had such success in bringing the house back to kind of level where it's now one of the go-to sources for dramatic haute couture on the red carpet. We couldn't have predicted 7 years ago when we were discussing this idea that would happen. But it's very good fortune and very good for the project that we've opened at a time when Daniel Roseberry's just presenting the most incredible pieces, incredible collections, and our public, our visitors, are very aware of his work.
So you have the idea for Schiaparelli. She was a very prolific designer. There's a lot to choose from. How do you winnow that down into the story that you tell in the exhibition, and how did you decide how to tell that story?
So that's actually a really good question, because it kind of goes very much to the heart of the curatorial process of working on a project like this. Because I started first with the V&A objects, knowing what we had, what kind of story those pieces told, what was missing that wasn't in the V&A's collection. And then you put on your detective hat and you become a bit like Sherlock Holmes and you start sleuthing.
Or you put on your shoe Schiaparelli hat.
Yes, you start sleuthing to find where else, what are the other sources of Schiaparelli material, of Elsa Schiaparelli material. And you start with the museums, because often their collections are online. So you have a kind of photographic encyclopedia of what's at various institutions. One of the largest holdings, I would say, is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And they have a large number of garments that were donated by Elsa Schiaparelli to the museum. And also the late curator there, Dilys Blum, who was the leading expert on Schiaparelli, was also a font of knowledge and information about the history of the designer. So I started with Dilys and with the Philadelphia Museum of Art, surveyed their collection, looked at other collections in the United States, also visited the kind of private collections and foundations, like the Elia Foundation in Paris has an incredible collection amassed by Azzedine Elia. I mean, the list is long. Also, at the same time, I was working alongside colleagues, my colleague Lydia Caston, who was project curator on this show, who came to the exhibition project with a deep knowledge of fashion photography, and also our colleague Rosalind McKeever, who's the V&A curator of paintings, and she worked on the art side of the exhibition. Because there's a very large art component, painting, sculpture, photography, Rosalind was key, and Lydia also, with her photography knowledge, they were both key in terms of sourcing the art aspect of the show. So we have incredible art loans from
I was going to say there's that Picasso
institutions.
Painting
Picasso painting from the Musée Picasso, an enormous Man Ray painting from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, loans from the Centre Pompidou in Paris. It's really, I think, something I'm very, very proud of, and it's thanks to the hard work and networks of my colleagues as well that allowed for such a rich selection of art within the exhibition. So I think that those aspects, the kind of sleuthing the fashion, sleuthing the art, those were happening side by side, simultaneously. And I think that the narrative arc was really formed around wanting to showcase those materials as best as possible, and also to kind of help the visitor make sense of the creative output, both of Elsa Schiaparelli, but also of Daniel Roseberry. So the meat of the exhibition is allowing for a display of the whole range of garments that Elsa created, from sportswear to daywear to evening wear, but then also focusing very much on her links with the fine art world, and as well as ensuring that the fashion accessories, hats, bags, shoes, jewelry, those finishing touches that kind of make people look twice, those are also part of the narrative. And then we were very proud to present new research. Not much has been talked about previous to this show about Schiaparelli's London house and her work with stage and screen. So we wanted to ensure that that was there. But of course, stops along the way showcase, we spotlight the work of Daniel Roseberry at key moments throughout the show to kind of provide a narrative for the visitor to ensure that they're aware of the ways in which his work has really brought attention to the house in recent years. That's kind of how we organized the exhibition narrative that places Elsa Schiaparelli in context, but also brings the story up to the present day with the work of Daniel Roseberry.
Do you have a favourite room in that exhibition or a little corner?
I quite like the room that talks about Schiaparelli London because that was an area of research that I pursued. We gathered together around a dozen garments that all have a Schiaparelli London label. And those are very rare because most of the production was in Paris. But I think the pieces that we've gathered together show that her London clients were just as adventurous and risk-taking as their Paris counterparts.
How did it work with the London office? Was she there, or was it she had a team and then sort of...
Well, the garments that have the London label were designed in Paris but made in London. So the London workrooms had around 80 people. In Paris, it was said that she employed around 400. So it gives you a sense of the smaller scale of the London operation. But Schiaparelli was based in Paris, but she was quite an energetic promoter of her London house and did come back and forth to the UK with regularity. And she presented fashion collections in her salon to gathered buyers, press, and clients, just as she did in Paris. I think that the London story is really interesting because Schiaparelli, most people, and I didn't know before working on this project, that Schiaparelli was part of the Fashion Group of Great Britain, which was actually the precursor to the British Fashion Council. And it was a precursor because it then morphed into the Incorporated Society of Fashion Designers, INCSOC. But Schiaparelli was one of the early sort of fashion designer members of that group, which was formed to celebrate and advocate for fashion made in Britain. And because she had a London salon, that was her membership in that group made sense. But she loved London. She loved the UK. She mentions London over 30 times in her autobiography. She loved a pub. She talks about going to pubs in London. And she often came to the UK to source textiles. So even before she opened her London branch, she was back and forth to Britain, Irish linens, wools from Scotland. She loved a tartan as well. There's tartan described in a lot of her press releases as a textile that she featured. So I'm quite proud of that part of the story that we've told within the exhibition about her London branch and how important it was to her as a designer.
Well, Sonnet, I think that brings us to the end of your Threads of Conversation. Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Threads of Conversation. If you enjoyed it, then don't forget to subscribe on your chosen platform and follow Threads of Conversation on Instagram and TikTok.